Investigators are considering prosecuting the El Paso massacre as a hate crime after an anti-immigrant manifesto believed to be written by the suspected gunman was found on the internet. It comes as a new report published by researchers at California State University, San Bernardino, shows a spike in hate crimes across the U.S. The report found hate crimes rose by 9% in 21 of the 30 major American cities. That marks an increase for a fifth consecutive year and is also a 10-year high. Let's bring in Professor Brian Levin. He is the director of the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, and one of the authors of that report. Professor, thanks very much for being with us. Your report found that white nationalists are growing or gaining more influence than other extremist groups. Why is that?
Great question. And let's start with the homicides, for instance. Listen to this. 2016, we had 3 by white supremacists in the United States. Then it went up the next year to 13 in 2017. Last year, it rose again to 17, and this year, we're still in August, white supremacist homicides have now outpaced all the other homicides that were extremist homicides for all of last year, and it's just August.
Wow, it is really sobering to see those numbers. According to your report, what fits the profile of contemporary mass murderers?
Really interesting. And again, what they found last year was that there were a substantial minority that had some kind of mental problem. And I know that's a big political football today. But here's the other thing. We now have 44% of Americans, according to a Reuters Ipsos poll, saying that whites are under attack, and that's up from 39% the year before. We can look at a variety of other surveys that show that somewhere between, let's say, 4% and 13% have the most hardened racist views, going from thinking Nazi views are acceptable or saying that interracial relationships are wrong. So here's the interesting thing. On a variety of different data points, whether it's criminal, whether it's online, or whether it's social surveys, we've been seeing kind of an upward slope. And that upward slope is sometimes interrupted by catalytic spikes. So for instance, November 2016, according to some research that James Nolan of West Virginia University and myself, along with some others did, what we found was November 2016, election month, was the worst month for hate crime, according to FBI data, going back to the first anniversary of 9/11, 14 years. And the day after Election Day was the worst day for hate crimes going back to 2003. And you know what was the number 2 worst time since 2010? Charlottesville, August 2017. One other quick thing while we're talking about politicians. When candidate Trump launched his campaign in a very crowded Newsweek field, hate crimes against Latinos did not go up. But go to November 2016 when he was elected, that group had the biggest increase. One other quick thing, December 2015, right after the San Bernardino terrorist attacks, there was already a spike from the terrorist attacks. After the Muslim ban proposal, hate crimes spiked another 23%. So that's why I think it's good that today, at the very least, the president said white supremacy and domestic terrorism in one word, because our center has been saying for some time that white supremacy is the most ascendant and largest terror threat in the United States in a rising pool. And we saw extremist homicides decline in recent years on the decline of homicides by violent Salafist jihadists who are inspired by groups like ISIS. They cratered. And who kind of replaced them on the deck? White supremacists.
Yeah, well, tell us more about the link between hate crimes and terrorism.
Great point. The definitions overlap. So for instance, a hate crime is if a criminal intentionally selects a victim or a target because of the actual or perceived status characteristic, like race or religion. Whereas terrorism is the use of force or threat to coerce a government, a population, or subgroup. And here's the thing, they overlap. But the bottom line is there is no domestic terrorism statute, so all of us on the outside have to curate the data ourselves. It would be nice if we could have the government do some of this, but bottom line is the cities, 30 of the largest cities went up 5 years in a row. They don't always presage what the rest of the country is going to do, but 80% of the time they do. And we had the steepest incline since 2015.
So on Monday, the president made a statement in the wake of these mass shootings. Let's listen to some of what he had to say.
In one voice, our nation must condemn racism, bigotry, and white supremacy. First, we must do a better job of identifying and acting on early warning signs. I am directing the Department of Justice to work in partnership with local, state, and federal agencies, as well as social media companies, to develop tools that can detect mass shooters before they strike. Second, we must stop the glorification of violence in our society. This includes the gruesome and grisly video games that are now commonplace. Third, we must reform our mental health laws to better identify mentally disturbed individuals who may commit acts of violence and make sure those people not only get treatment, but when necessary, involuntary confinement. Mental illness and hatred pulls the trigger, not the gun. Fourth, we must make sure that those judged to pose a grave risk to public safety do not have access to firearms, and that if they do, those firearms can be taken through rapid due process.
He later called for the death penalty for mass murderers. Professor, what do you make of the president's response?
Too little, too late, but I'll give him a single. And here's why, because he said domestic terrorism and white supremacy in the same sentence. But I'll tell you something, I don't think it's enough. He retweeted white nationalists, for instance, people who've been convicted of hate in Britain. What we found, let me just go back to the data for a second. Listen to this. President Bush spoke 6 days after 9/11 about tolerance towards Muslims. Hate crimes dropped by 2/3 the next day and 2/3 the next year against our Muslim friends and neighbors. When he spoke after the San Bernardino terrorist attack, as I said, we had an increase. What we need is something sustained. I wish his message at the top talked about white supremacy in the same way that he would have talked about violent Salafist jihadists. He was very tough on President Obama for not saying what he thought the terrorism threat was. I think now the tables are turned. Mr. Trump is now the president, and I think he has to prioritize white supremacy. He didn't do it after Christchurch, and what we're seeing is a continuing trend of these domestic terrorists. We have ticking time bombs, and we have to have greater coordination, and we have to have greater help to local authorities from the feds. And there has to be a message from the top. Executive leadership matters. He's going to set a tone for priority and enforcement, and I think that he hasn't done that. Let's see how it goes. He scored one single. We're not even out of the inning, and we are facing a white supremacist domestic terror threat. It is the most ascendant, and it is striking how much it's changed since I testified before Congress in 2015, and then I warned about violent Salafist jihadists. It's no longer that.
All right, Brian Levin, Professor, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.